at some point, the whole edifice just topples. And you say, well, the Fed's going to save us. Well, don't be surprised if the Fed says, no, we'll clean up the mess. And so they'll step back and let the whole thing go and then say, okay, bring in the cleanup crew. Meanwhile, a lot of people are going to get hurt. So I see surveys of what people are expecting. The average investor, Joe Sixpack investor, thinks they're going to get 15%. We're at top 1% valuations in equities. They think we're going to get 15%. We can't even get a positive return on bonds. They think they're going to get 15%.
It's my pleasure to welcome David Collum back to the show. He's been on a few times, and every year he does this amazing amount of research for his year in review. This year, it's about 190 pages long. He is a Betty R. Miller Professor of Chemistry and Chemical Biology at Cornell University. He's an intellectual. He researches stuff deeply. And one of the things I said to him before we started today is this year, or last year, I guess, there is no shortage of content. David, welcome back. How are you?
Yeah, I'm glad to be back. Looking forward to it.
No shortage of content, right?
No shortage of content. Yeah, some of it's appalling, but
it is appalling. It really is. So just give us your big take, Dave, and tell us, what you really spent maybe the most time on or wrote the most about.
Well, the two things I labored the most over and had the most difficulty with turned out to be the COVID and the election because everyone was sequestered. And I try to write about things people are not thinking about, maybe missing the plot line on. And every basement, every house in the country had an epidemiologist, virologist combo expert who were convinced they understood what they were seeing. And so how do you write about that? I found 2020 to be a particularly bleak year, not from the perspective of the COVID per se, but just social trends and of course financial trends, because I think the Fed's sending us towards the precipice.
Okay, so let's talk about the financial stuff first. We've never seen more currency creation ever than we did last year, and we're about to see a lot more. And Jerome Powell just doesn't seem concerned. It's like that. It's sort of before they wanted to come at the money creation sort of from an angle, right? But now it's like the gloves are off. It's just, we're going to just stimulate as much as we need to. We don't care. We're in this environment of these insanely low negative interest rates. I mean, in real terms, they're negative interest rates. This is a dysfunctional mess, isn't it?
Well, it certainly is. I think it was Kevin Warsh who said that it would have been nice if we had entered this COVID crisis without having treated every day in the last 10 years as an emergency. So we basically entered this crisis already in a world of trouble. We had a massive corporate debt bubble. And in theory, people always talk about a correction, like the March correction. To technically call it a correction, you have to correct something, and they corrected absolutely nothing. And so we have more debt. People are in more trouble. The economy is weaker. The word stimulus is a euphemism for hyper monetary policy. It doesn't stimulate anything. This year was tricky because it's not like you could tell people they're not allowed to work and then say, and we're not going to compensate you for sitting at home. So it was just a humanitarian effort to print money this year. But I don't see a way out of this one. We've created massive amounts of additional debt. We've got markets that are, I think it was Druckenmiller the other day said they're crazier than he's ever seen in his life. And this guy's been around for a half a century. And you got Jeremy Grantham saying for 3 years, he said we're in a bubble, but it's not over. Now he's saying it's over. So he doesn't mean necessarily today, but he sees it. He sees all the symptoms of the very, very end of a bubble phase. And this bubble is based on a pathetically bad story. This is not a euphoric technological revolution. It's not like Japan pretending to change the world or take over the world. The story is the Fed won't let the markets drop. That's a really stupid bubble.
So the question is, What do you mean when you say bubble? That word is used a lot. Like, what does that mean to people watching and listening to us when you say bubble?
Okay, well, there's degrees of bubble. Using an 18, I rounded up 20 metrics of valuation relative to historical norms. In 2018, all 20 showed us within an error bar of being a factor of 2 overvalued. So a 50% correction. And one which stayed down would have corrected the excess. And of course, it didn't stay down, and it didn't happen. And so I'd call that a bubble, because I showed a plot this year that was a Collum original. And I showed 4 paths that correct at 2x overvaluation. One is an immediate drop, and that's a 50% correction. The other is a horizontal water tread. So you say you're not going to make any money, any real inflation-adjusted return until you sort of return to fair value. And that turns out to be 35 years. At the rate of GDP growth that we experienced in the 20th century. And then there were variations, like you could take 25 years with a 20% drop, or take 50 years with a 15 or 16% nominal real gain over 50 years. There is no path to go from 2x overvalued to historical fair value that doesn't involve excruciating amounts of either price correction or time. And so
now, when you say this, are you talking like broadly just all assets, or are you talking about the stock market, the S&P? What do you mean?
Well, the stock market in general, but the bond market's the most overvalued bond market in history. We're something like 5,000-year lows, whatever that means, right? Heaven only knows what the Sumerians were charging, but bonds are so profoundly overpriced that you essentially can't make money. Now, if you're a bond trader, you can, because you can make money, going playing blackjack in Vegas too. But if you buy standard issue treasuries or standard issue safe assets, inflation adjusted, you're guaranteed to lose. I think the 30 years at 1.9%. I guarantee you inflation's not at 1.9%. And so the only question you face when you're buying bonds is, for how long do I want to lose money? Not how much you can make. There's no revenue stream left in the bond market.
That's amazing. It really is totally dysfunctional. But, you got to wonder, of course, inflation is massively underreported, right? Especially when you put into that equation asset inflation, which, of course, is not really part of the CPI, but it's still there nonetheless, right? But even then, inflation isn't as high as one might expect, given all the creation of new currency and new credit and all these instruments, really. How have they been able to dodge hyperinflation, which is probably what we should have? And can they just keep doing it forever?
I don't know your listeners well, but if they've been paying close attention to the world, they'll be familiar with the Chapwood Index, or they'll be familiar with shadowstats.com. I love the Chapwood Index.
I've had John Williams on the phone, not so much the other index.
Witowski or something with Chapwood Securities, and he produced an index that shows the inflation 50 of the largest cities, which means most of the population. And he looks at 500 items, and he uses a very sort of meat and potato scale to measure price. So there's no hedonic adjustments, no substitution, no nothing. He just looks at price. And over the last 5 to 6 years in the 50 largest cities, inflation, according to the Chapwood Index, is running at 10%.
I just grabbed it really quick so we could talk about it specifically. New York City, he's saying last year, first half of 2019, 12.1% inflation. Los Angeles, 12.6%. Chicago, 10.7%. Houston, 9.7%. Philadelphia, 11.2%. Phoenix, 7.6%. San Antonio, 9.8%. San Diego, 11.2%, San Jose, 12.6%. There are others, and even places like, Jacksonville, Florida, one of our markets where we recommend rental properties, 8.7%. Another one where we recommend Indianapolis, 9.3%. So, those aren't all like high flying cities. Now, granted, a lot of this has changed with geography changing and what I call the 2020 grapes of wrath, this mass migration out of these expensive cities, which I think is actually a good thing. And, should have happened a long time ago. And, it was just massively accelerated. But these are significant inflation numbers. And, people kind of, one of the things I say, Dave, is that I'm constantly telling my listeners they've got to watch old movies, old TV shows, read old books, listen to old music. And when I say old, I only mean 30 years old, 40 years old, not that long ago. Okay. Watch stuff from the 70s. Life, in many ways, even when you compare it to the terrible 70s, has really gotten much more meager. You look at housing prices, and it's so inaccurate how it's measured because the house inside got bigger, it got nicer, certainly, but there's no yard anymore. There's, everybody's on top of each other in this high density environments that they didn't used to have. The typical baby boomer home in, say, Lakewood, California, coming back from World War II, was on a quarter-acre lot, okay, maybe even a half acre, right? It's just a totally different thing nowadays.
Well, I actually wrote a blog. I wrote an email that was turned into a blog years ago by Elizabeth Warren, and I relayed to her a story that happened, and she said, "This is exactly the kind of thing I'm looking for." So she put it on her website back before she was famous. We used to swap emails late at night, and I happen to remember that when I was maybe 14, buying an extra large pizza at a pizzeria, where the Italian guys, whatever, not Domino's, but also not some New York City pizzeria, just some guys. It was an extra large plain pizza I bought for $2. I also happen to know rather explicitly that at that same age, around 14, I could carry a couple of golf bags for 4 hours and get paid $10. I was being paid 1.25 extra large pizzas per hour as a 14-year-old.
You don't get that today.
You don't get that. You'd have to be doing tricks on the street to get that kind of pay as a 14-year-old. And so, so that shows you, it's a combination of sort of an inflation rate, but it shows you what kind of spending power you had and how, when I was a kid, you'd watch TV shows and the father would be a bus driver or own a shoe store or something.
And he'd own a house.
And they still had a family and things like that. And that's just not even theoretically possible.
Yeah, and mom didn't work, and
right.
The kids went to like good quality public schools, and they had a home in a nice neighborhood with low crime. And what a lot of people don't notice too, Dave, is all of these things that we're just being charged for that used to be free, like parking everywhere, and just all of this stuff that you're doing all this stuff yourself nowadays, where you just have no like breathing room or margin. I used to have a travel agent. You used to go into restaurants and get waited on. Now, and I'm not talking COVID. I'm just talking life and before that. Now, you go up and wait at the counter. They might bring you your food, but it's like minimal service. You go to, last week I stayed at the beautiful, iconic Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami. I spoke at a conference down there in Miami Beach. And this is like this iconic hotel. No service. There's like no staff around. You can't get help with anything. These places, there used to be there's just no people around anymore. And this is not given the pandemic. Okay. This is before that. You've got these buildings, these hotels, and they're like run by just a few skeleton crew people because it's so expensive to employ people. And, the people are being tracked and monitored, and they have no leisure in their jobs anymore. God forbid they work for Amazon, slave driver company. They can't even rest or talk or have a conversation with their coworkers without being, sanctioned by their boss.
Well, the other unseen inflation, which I, again, several times I've written about it, is the depreciation rate. So I do a big segment this year about wealth creation, and I talk about what the GDP does not show you. If you go to the movies with your family, it costs you about $100, and the experience that goes into GDP, but it also has a life expectancy of 2.5 hours. And whereas if you bought, say, a Black & Decker grill or something, we put a refrigerator to pasture this year out of a cabin, and it was 70 years old. When they created that refrigerator, it was huge wealth creation because, first of all, it's operationally not that different. Doesn't have an ice maker. Okay, big deal. But it lasted 70 years. And so I reintroduced the idea of using what's called NDP, or net domestic product. And that's the cost of something minus the depreciation. And so we've got huge depreciation rates. And to me, those are what
do you mean? Are you just saying that products are built to have obsolescence sooner? They're not built to last like they used to be? Is that
right? They're absolutely built not to last. So I have a dishwasher in my house, which was built in '89, and the woman who cleans the house says, "Yeah, that's probably the original." So that dishwasher has been banging around for 31 years. If I bought a replacement, it would still clean the dishes about the same, and it would last about 7 years, is the estimate. So to compare those two dishwashers, and the economists like to say, well, the new one has all these buttons and gadgets. Who cares? I just need something to squirt the dishes with a lot of water. But you have to account for the fact that I get out of the first dishwasher 4, 5, maybe 10 times the amount of usage. And that's inflationary. If the automatic window in your car breaks, it's a 50-cent piece of plastic, but you're going to end up spending $500 to replace the unit required. So the repairs, how many things do you break that you can repair? That's huge depreciation rates. So accelerated depreciation is a mask of hidden inflation. And everything we buy, and a great example, here's one for you, your cell phone. It's a miracle of modern technology, right? How can you possibly talk about the inflationary effects of the cell phone? Well, first and foremost, you have to buy one every couple of years. They go out of date. I couldn't use Audible on my old cell phone. I had to buy a new one to get Audible. The other thing is you say, but it's miraculous. I go, yes, but it's required. And so you take a family of 4 and they're required. And so you got to buy the phones and you got to pay for the phone service. And pretty soon you're talking, I don't know what, $200 a month at least.
Well, and everybody's got to have a laptop and an iPad too.
Well, you have to, or your kids.
Yeah, you can't function.
You can't function. And so how do you account for the added costs of miraculous technology that's no longer optional? How do you account for the fact that, if you're earning $50,000, you might be dropping 4% of your income on tech that you didn't have to drop 4% of your income on?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. You're not going to be able to get an education, go to school, or do anything if you don't have the technology. And of course, then there's all these subscriptions we all have too. Those aren't counted in the CPI. I used to have, maybe a couple subscriptions. When I signed up for AOL in the 90s, that was like a big thing, whether I want to spend $10 a month or whatever it costs. Now you got a myriad array of subscriptions. I mean, I have hundreds of subscriptions to things and they all have to be managed. They suck up my time. The credit cards expire. They need to be, it's just a whole different world. I mean, look, I'm not a total pessimist. I do think it's an amazing time to be alive because I keep getting amazed by this technology. But I think it's the concept of margin and the concept that we're doing this all ourselves nowadays. There's no service anymore. Dave, what is it that tech companies are excused from answering the phone?
I'm trying to get a third credit card because I want to have one card that I do just auto payments on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good idea.
So I can see what I'm being pinged on every month much more easily. And I'm having so much trouble. And I'm going to the same card company. So I've got 2 credit cards and they're making me jump through hoops. I'm going, dudes, you already gave me 2 cards. Give me a third card. It's just
everything's run by a stupid algorithm,
So I don't know. I asked the question, what the tech company, I've got a big section on this wealth creation idea. And I asked the question, what do these silicon-based Goliaths do compared to their carbon-based Goliaths, ExxonMobil, US Steel, things like that? The wealth creation of the early 20s was way, way, way higher than the wealth creation of the present. So you can say, what about Amazon? Well, the Sears Roebuck catalog was way more pioneering than Amazon, way more pioneering. You went from buying flour and nails and stuff out of a barrel in a country store to be able to order thousands of different things. This was 120 years ago. And so you could order it. It might take you 2 weeks instead of 1 day. Who cares? And so the Sears Roebuck catalog was a massive increase in wealth creation. and Amazon is incremental. So then I look at Google or Facebook. Facebook could disappear today. No one would care. No one would care.
As long as it disappeared for everybody at the same time.
But Facebook's scraping data to sell the advertising. It's just advertising.
Yeah.
So if they want to try to sell me a certain kind of mattress or a certain kind of car, whatever, but it's not in any way wealth creation, it's ever so slightly, for example, they target me better, signed up with a better, more appropriate car than I would have gotten maybe. But they're gigantic advertising budgets. Throw a tax on the system. I don't need them scraping data to try to tell me what to buy because I know what to buy. I know what I need.
What do you think is going to happen? I mean, what are your thoughts about inflation? First of all, we both agree it's already here, but how much worse is it going to be?
Well, so if you read some of the ancient archives and talks about the idea of inflating away debt, which appears to be the subplot that they're doing. Now, here's the problem. The way you create inflation is through creating more debt. And so if you ask, where did all this inflation come from? You say, well, we created huge amounts of additional debt. So we're not inflating away anything. We're creating the debt phenomenon. And so I think the whole idea of inflating away debt might be a fiction.
Tell us about that, because one of the strategies that I love using in with real estate investing is that you get these cheap 30-year fixed rate mortgages. You let the tenant pay the mortgage for you, and then inflation pays the debt off as well, which is a wonderful strategy. It seems to be what the U.S. is trying to do to China. What do you mean when you're saying that's a fiction?
Okay, so on the receiving end of your mortgage, right, on the receiving end of real estate, is some other person who's not getting adequately compensated.
Right. It transfers wealth from the lender to the borrower.
And that's right. So if I'm a boomer with a 60-40 portfolio or whatever, my 40 is returning nothing. And that returning of nothing is so that people who at one point in history had something of value, we call it capital. And I needed something. I needed capital, or someone else needed capital. So you need the capital for your building. I have capital. I lend it to you. You hope to turn the capital into some sort of wealth creation. You build new buildings. You build apartment complexes, and then you rent them. Right? That's wealth creation. I am compensated for giving you access to my capital. The Federal Reserve, by blanketing the earth in free money, they've essentially rendered capital worthless. And so why would you ever borrow from me at, let's say, a fair rate? If inflation 10%, I'd be charging you 12, right? So let's say inflation is 10%. I'd charge you 10. Let's say we're both nuts and inflation's really 2. I'd be charging you 5. I can't get 5% for my money.
Right.
And so they're taking my money. They somehow rigged the system such that the lenders get nothing, which means therefore pension funds are getting nothing, pensioners are getting nothing, and they're going to send us sailing up a cliff because this has a bad ending.
Oh, for the pensions, it has a very bad ending. And when do we start to see that? Is that 5 years away, 10 years away? How far in the future is that? Because these pension plans, they can't get any return on their money without taking inordinate risk. And same with any kind of like endowment or just anything.
Well, I don't know. It's going to be one of these things where when it happens, it happens. I don't know when. It feels like we're really near the end. The GameStop euphoria and all that stuff, and Bitcoin, all these things that are happening in investing are investors reaching for yield. And yep. they're going away from lending money to major corporations and the mortgage-backed security markets and things like that, and going to things where they can actually get a return. This is a massive reach for yield. And it'll end badly. There's a maximum that says more people have died at the reaching for a yield than at the point of a gun. The junk bond market now, corporate junk bonds return something like 5%. That's not a good deal. When those things are defaulting, which by the way, they are going to start defaulting because of all the commercial real estate is going to go to hell because of the COVID shutdown. And at some point, the whole edifice just topples. And you say, well, the Fed's going to save us. Well, don't be surprised if the Fed says, no, we'll clean up the mess. And so they'll step back and let the whole thing go and then say, okay, bring in the cleanup crew. Meanwhile, a lot of people are going to get hurt. So I see surveys of what people are expecting. The average investor, Joe Sixpack investor, thinks they're going to get 15%. We're at top 1 percentile valuations in equities. They think we're going to get 15%. We can't even get a positive return on bonds. They think they're going to get 15%. Fidelity and the various pension funds are assuming 7.5%. They're not going to get 7.5% either. If you listen to the smart guys, they're saying, next 10 years, maybe annualized -5%. So the system at some point is just going to snap. And the Fed, instead of letting controlled burns clear out the fuel and sober people up, we have a situation where the Fed has convinced everyone that there's no risk now. And that you have your seatbelt and you can't be hurt. You've got airbags and the Fed's there and you can't be hurt. Stability breeds instability. That's an old maxim too. Well, the Fed is trying to create the air of stability. And then when we have this mess, who's going to go hang the Fed from the nearest tree? They're going to say, oh, we didn't see it coming. Greenspan said, oh, we had an error in our model. Yeah, the error in your model was between your ears, you moron. And they don't have a model. They're just winging it. So I think the question is Powell, do Powell and the gang know? Are they terrified or are they arrogant? They think they can somehow pull this off. Are they King Canute? Which, by the way, the Canute story is vague as to what actually he said. I asked the smartest guys, some bright guys, and they don't know. They think it's sort of a combination of arrogance and ignorance, but they somehow think they can pull this off, and I don't. I don't think it's even theoretically possible to have a soft landing. I just don't know when we're going to have enough fuel in the tank in this flight to make it to the crash site.
To make it through the crash zone.
To the crash site. Oh,
to the crash site.
We're
okay.
going to get us to the crash site.
Yeah. And this disaster that you're talking about is an inflationary crash,
I don't know.
Right?
I don't know that. I used to be all inflation. I really believe Bernanke or these guys when they said, a determined central banker can create inflation. I'm not positive they can now. Now, if they really, really, really are desperate, and they say, we are just going to send the printing presses whirring until we get inflation, then they can get inflation. But they're going to have to do it in the face of horrific data saying they're making a mistake. In Weimar Germany, when they ended up, with, thousands of percent inflation, they went from, 1 Deutschmark becoming worth the equivalent of 4 trillion Deutschmarks later. It's this ridiculous thing. They were so proud of their ability to print Deutschmarks in the volume. They thought it was good. The system's demanding more money because it was inflationary. And they thought, well, then we should provide more money. And and this wasn't antiquity. This was the 20th century. They did not understand that the printing of the money was creating the inflation. How they could not know this, I don't know, but they didn't. They were proud of their ability to print money. It was like a stat. Oh, we can print X Deutschmarks a day. And that's what Bernanke and Powell.
Well, Germans are just proud that they're being efficient, even if they're efficiently wrong, right?
But I think the Germans are probably going to be one of the early Western countries to recognize we're on the wrong path because they've been hurt by it too much. And so I think we're likely to be one of the last ones to recognize. By the way, during this crisis, there's great stats out there. The United States took on huge debt. China did not add any leverage. China got through this crisis without adding leverage. So guess who won that?
But China overall, I worry about China in the short term. I don't worry about them in the long term because they got a big demographic problem headed their way. So you push out 10 to 15 years, and I think China is not a contender in terms of taking the number 1 spot from the U.S. Maybe before that they would, but then it'll regress.
No, but they could be part of a cannibalization of us.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So this could be one of these things where it's like Walmart and Lowe's battling each other and there's no one left on the battlefield to clean up the mess. And so China.
You probably meant to say Home Depot, I'm guessing.
Home Depot,
Lowe's,
yeah.
Right.
I don't care, but
Walmart and Amazon, Home Depot and Lowe's, yeah.
But it's quite possible that they will be part of our demise without actually themselves winning either. I have no trouble with that. We're just putting on too much debt. And history shows no one ever puts there's only one example of a country that got way, way, way out of whack and picked up this much debt and grew their way out. And that was Britain in the 19th century. They clawed their way out, but they were an empire, and they were not yet a finished empire. And so I don't see the wealth creation in this country that will pull us out of this debt mess.
It's interesting, though, because it's so uneven, right? There is a massive wealth concentration. And, like I said earlier, watch old TV shows, watch old movies. And it's so interesting, like to watch, say, Columbo, for example, right? Which I think Columbo was a brilliant detective, and he always had his funny mannerisms and things. But, you watch Columbo or Heart to Heart or any old show, and say Columbo is investigating like a wealthy person, right? In a crime, and he goes to their house, and that house is nothing compared to what you see wealthy people having today. And the kind of wealth nowadays is just like massive oligarchical wealth. It's absolutely staggering. These, tech billionaires and we're going to see trillionaires in the not too distant future, I think.
There's a brilliant book, Coming Apart, I think it's called. By,
Charles. I read
Murray.
that. Yeah, Charles Murray. Yeah, he was one of the co-authors of The Bell Curve, I think.
Exactly. And so he became very contentious. But Coming Apart's this brilliant expose about how he talks about what's changed over the last, say, 70 years. Yep. And he points out that when the greatest generation was in charge, there was not the visual difference in wealth, so that it was not status to have a huge house. My dad was really pretty wealthy, and we had probably a 2,000 square foot house. He ran a construction company with 350 people employed, right? Nowadays, he'd be living in some damn 6,000 square foot mansion. He lived in a 2,000 square foot house, just sort of typical post-war kind of house. And standards to get into schools were not so stratified. There were all sorts of changes that have occurred, and this growth in wealth status and class status. And that could argue why we're in such a mess now, because now we have a culture war going on.
Yeah. Well, that's a good area to kind of switch gears to, is the culture war. Right. And I know we've got to wrap it up, but the censorship, the gloves are off with everything that happened in the election. Nobody will deny anymore that there is massive bias, massive censorship, and the world is being run by the corporatocracy and the tech companies and the corporatized media. And it's absolutely disgusting. Can that pendulum ever swing back? What happened to Trump, I thought was just absolutely insane, the way they vilified him.
Even worse than vilifying Trump is vilifying Trump voters.
Right. So good distinction.
I am staggered by the number of people who are using a language that sure as hell sounds like 1930s Germany. And they're talking about deprogramming us. One of the prominent journalists made reference to cleansing the world of Trump supporters. Really going to use the word cleanse? Well,
and another one made reference to drone strikes against Trump supporters.
This is not just sore winners, right? These are not people who are not winning gracefully. They won the election. They're saying things now. They're talking about things like, here's when Jewish privilege now they're talking out there because the wealthy are also highly popular with the Jews. If I were a Jew, I'd be going,
scary
crap. Yeah. I've been down this path before. I've seen how this one ends. And they're doing this in the white privilege, and the whole narrative is so caustic, and it's not coming from the right; it's coming from the left.
And what's interesting about that is the two groups you mentioned, Jews and whites. Many of them seem like willing victims in their own demise. I mean,
there's not a lot of pushback.
Yeah.
And the fact that you can't even post an article on Twitter or on Facebook without risking getting kicked off the site. I got kicked off Twitter for a week because I criticized Fauci in an admittedly off-color way. But the narratives are getting squashed like bugs. I just tried to search something. I showed my brother a video, and then he said, it's been deleted already. I went looking for it. And all you find are counterattacks against the narrative that it made. So I think we're in a horrible, horrible situation. And I don't know if this is darkest before the dawn and this will pass, or if this is really the rise of authoritarianism. What I can tell you is there's nothing in the data that suggests this is different than previous murderous authoritarian regimes. There's nothing in the data that says this is why this is just a fad or this is why this is a passing thought. We are following the script perfectly to an authoritarian state.
And that is very scary. You know, David, over 20 years ago, I talked about how if I get to live my whole natural life, which I hope I do, I will see states secede from the Union. Can the country stay together like this? Is there any, you know, Joe Biden and his bullshit unity thing, but I mean, is there any coming together after all of this?
I don't know. I'm not sure what secession achieves. So and
I'm also not sure what it would even look like. So
in the Civil War, you had the state, you know, you had the slave versus free states. And so there was a natural dotted line wherever they wanted to draw it.
Right.
Now
you don't have that now.
So I've been talking with people about bug out plans. What's a bug out plan? Well, a friend of mine, Grant Williams, said he was sitting at a table with a bunch of hedge fund managers, and every single one of them had a bug out plan.
Yeah, and he's the interest rate guy. So Grant Williams.
And he said that the bug out plan is where when things get bad, you make a phone call, which kicks everything into gear. You drive to the airport, you get on your jet, and you fly, and you go. For Joe Sixpack, that's not a viable plan. But I have had a lot of discussions with people about what a more conservative bug out plan would be. And one of them would be to say, where in the country, as a conservative, as a person who would be potentially targeted, where could they live where they would not be accessible? And the two criteria, one would be population density low, right? So, you know, the Dakotas, Maine, you name it, and places where you might see, you know, Trump supporters and places like that. So if I moved to some small hamlet in Maine, I'd probably not get squashed like a bug. But if I'm in New York City, I'm at great risk. And so I got an email from a guy who's a distressed asset investor who's anonymous on Twitter, but he's a prominent guy. And he said for the first time in his life, he feels unsafe because of his political views. Yep.
And that is a realistic statement, sadly.
Yeah, and I don't know why. It feels like it's a left-wing thing, but it's also possible I'm blind to the right's contribution here. I just don't know why.
Yeah. Yeah, and what's interesting about it is you have the ultra rich oligarchical left, and then you have the people burning down Seattle and Portland and Philadelphia and Chicago and New York and, you know, virtually every other major city, Minneapolis, don't forget that one, Kenosha as well. I mean, how do these groups get together? Why are they friends?
I think the latter on somebody's payroll. So I think the Antifa model is actually paid sort of brown shirt equivalents. And so I'm not convinced the sort of super rich left-wing enemy model is quite right. We're not being sort of steered by Silicon Valley because there are a bunch of rich left-wing guys who have these views. I think it's deeper and darker than that. And I think this is about some globalist view and what they're trying to achieve. And I've talked to people about what that could be, right? You've heard about the Great Reset. Does anyone have a clue what that really means?
Right.
But one of the theories is that people in positions of power have a global overview and they say, look, we are running out of resources and we have to somehow dial back everyone's expectations, and this is how we're going to do it, right? So this is the big sort of grand conspiracy theory. The other is, you know, it's the opposition to the United States, which there's certainly plenty of detractors, right? We have allies who would turn on us, I think, pretty fast if they had to, and the question is, are they trying to dethrone the dominance of the United States? I presume you've seen that World Economic Forum advertisement.
Of course. Yeah.
And they talk about how the U.S. is not going to be the superpower and you're not going to own anything. You're going to rent everything.
But you're going to be happy.
But you're going to be happy. And I go, rent from whom? Right?
Yeah. From Klaus. From Klaus Schwab.
I'm reading the first of 3 books. I'm in the middle of his first of 3 books.
I just finished his Industrial Revolution book. Of course, I'm going to...
the 2015 book. Yeah, that's what I'm in.
Yeah, that's older. I know. But it seems like it's a lot of words, but he doesn't really say anything significant.
That's right. In fact, the whole Great Reset sounds like platitudes, duck-filled platitudes, I call them. So the question is, what is it? Could be dethroning the dollar. I've become increasingly aware of the possibility that much of what we're observing is coming from China, even though we're not seeing the connection. It's not easy. For example, if you want to see who's probably not guilty, look at whoever's being blamed. The Russians are getting clobbered. I think Putin is simply trying to hold together a third world country from falling into its foundations. And there's no doubt he's a rough guy, but I don't think Putin gives a damn about our elections. I think he's just trying to keep Russia from imploding. China, on the other hand, there's some very strange videos coming out of China by Xi Jinping's right-hand man talking about how they control the U.S.'s politics completely and how Trump disrupted that and how now they're okay again. And you go, what? Why would he say that in a public forum, right? And the answer, if you get the answer to that, you'll understand what the point is. I think over time, we're going to trace a lot more back to mainland China than we realize. I think that's going to be true.
Very interesting. David, I could talk to you for a long, long time about all this stuff, but do give out any resource or website you want to share and wrap it up for us with any closing thoughts on any part of your year in review.
Well, you can reach me on Twitter for the time being.
As long as you're still there, yes.
Yeah, at David B. Collum. My email is easily accessed from my Twitter bio, or anyone who wants to search David Collum, Cornell Chemistry, it'll be there. I'm not hard guy to find. Overarching view, I worry about social change. I think we're in the middle of something so bleak. And we're either going to pull out of it or we're going to push through it. And pushing through it's going to be painful.
I hate to bring you on another tangent because I know we got to wrap up, but just on that, if anybody was sitting in the 60s and they were sort of an older person or an establishment person, if you will, and they were watching Woodstock, they were watching Vietnam War protests, they were watching all the crazy stuff that went on in the 60s and the early 70s, they would have thought, maybe they could have thought, okay, I don't know what they thought, but maybe they could have thought, oh my God, the country's ripping apart. This is a disaster. We'll never recover from this. Are we thinking that now? Do these young people that are just way off on the wrong track, that are destroying these cities, that are just brainwashed by these educational institutions, do they grow out of it like the baby boomers did? Or is this different?
Well, if there is a difference, I think back then, and I was a kid, so I wouldn't have known, but I suspect back then that at no point did the adults question the integrity of the system, meaning they didn't think that the system itself was going to collapse. So they're watching the kids saying those worthless pot smoking,
hippies.
Hippies are a problem. The world's going to fall apart when they become in charge. The problem now is these crazy, crazy ideas are absolutely already infiltrating the adult world. And so various institutions are bringing in various cockeyed theories about how to engineer social change inside the companies. It's not just crazy campus behavior now. It is invaded the corporate boardroom.
Yeah. Yeah, it really has. You saw that with, what happened after George Floyd and all this craziness. Yeah, it is.
So it's not just the kids.
Yeah,
it's not just it is also not just a weak subgroup of society in which the people who are in power, there's no doubt they're going to retain their power. It's not that I think everything we have now should be retained, right? I think change is important. But it feels like it could rip apart at the seams at the most fundamental upper levels, right? If you look who's in Congress, there's some scary people there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no question about it.
It's
like we have a whole new version of McCarthyism with this censorship and the putting Trump supporters on lists, and it's just scary stuff.
But Jonathan Turley is the guy you ought to be reading if you're a listener.
Do you mean Steve Turley?
No, Jonathan, the George Washington University constitutional scholar, who I think is at the level of potential Supreme Court nominee, although unless the Republicans get reelected, he won't get it. And he said this is the most dangerous assault on free speech in history. Yeah, right now.
I would agree with that. And a lot of people should be very, very concerned, including those who are benefiting from it. Because guess what? You're next. Yeah, that's what they better know. Good point.
Niemöller moment.
Yeah. David, thank you so much. You've got such great insights. We always appreciate having you on, and keep the faith and keep in touch. Okay.
I'll try.